Welcome to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church.
Good morning, everybody. I realised I stood up here last week, didn't tell anyone my name. You just had to guess. So my name last week and this week is Gail Oakey, and I'm doing the first Bible reading this week, which is found in Judges chapter 16, and it is the whole chapter. So let's start at verse 1. I'm not sure what page it is. In the large print version, which I've got, it's on page 242. One day, Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told, "Samson is here." So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, "At dawn we'll kill him." But Samson lay there only until midnight. Then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the two posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them up onto his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me up with 7 fresh bowstrings that have been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his great strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." He said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him with them. Then with men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. Delilah then said to Samson, "All this time you have been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me, how can you be tied?" He replied, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with a pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. Again she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke from his sleep and pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more. He has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now, the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste to our land and multiplied our slain." While they were in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of prison, and he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women who were watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just one more time. Let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached towards the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one, his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more than when he died than when he lived. Then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had led Israel 20 years.
Good morning. My name is Bronwyn. The Bible reading this morning from the New Testament is actually from Acts chapter 2, starting at verse 22. So ignore that. If you are using one of the church Bibles, it's on page 1091, and we're starting down the bottom. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him.
We had a wonderful time at Mount Riverview this morning with Michael and Rani Grievous-Allison, which I think you will meet next week sometime. It is wonderful. They are putting themselves forward, or have put themselves forward, for missionary service to Belgium. I'm not going to spoil all the surprises, but it is wonderful to see the way God calls different people, calling them out of some important and effective ministries into another ministry. When we are children, we dream about what we might become as adults, don't we? I don't know what you might have dreamed of, but there usually are lots of exciting ideas when you're a kid. You're going to be a sports person, dancer, singer, actor, someone famous. I don't know. How many of you 60s kids wanted to be an astronaut? Probably a few. Nothing wrong with those childhood dreams, but they often revolved around being someone distinct, someone extraordinary, someone who by the nature of their career stands out separate from the rest. But then you become that strange being called a teenager. And the idea of standing out, especially of becoming extraordinary or separate, strangely but insistently becomes terrifying. We don't want to stand out. We prefer to dissolve safely into the crowd. And sometimes there is that paralyzing fear that we might choose the wrong thing. We might end up, having the wrong path, consigning ourselves to a life of discontent and disappointment, and the pressure of our individualistic ideas that we make for ourselves, that we make our own destiny. The pressure of that is relentless, and that we are the sum of our own choices. But what if we were to know that we belong to someone else? That we belong to someone else, that we are not our own, that we are called, indeed, separated. The book of Judges that we've been reading over the last few weeks began with Israel receiving the land that God had promised to their ancestors. They were to completely take this land. They were not to share it. The inhabitants of this land before them were worshippers of foreign gods. They were to be displaced. They were not to amalgamate with them. They were not to make treaties or agreements with them. They were to drive them out and be separate from them. But we barely got past the first page when the wheels started to fall off. Judges 2 verse 2, you are not to make a covenant with the people who are living in this land, and you are to tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? See, the tension runs through the whole book. We've mentioned this before. God has called them to be holy and separate from all the other nations. They are taken from the other nations, but Israel have constantly wanted to be like the other nations, worshipping their gods and living their way. And so God hands them over to these foreign nations who cruelly oppress them. They cry out to God, save us, save us. And well, he raises up a judge who leads them, who delivers them. But when the judge dies, they fall straight back in to their sin. Well, welcome to the story of Samson. Here we go again. In the cycle of Samson, there's a story barely begins before before things we start to see it. But actually, I should say the cycle of Samson actually begins way back in chapter 13. We read from chapter 16, but it begins in chapter 13, and as it begins, it almost stops straight away. If we go to chapter 13, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. That sounds familiar, but we've been trained to expect what will happen next. They will cry out to God, and God will send a judge, but no. Here there is silence. Israel have sunk so low, they don't even seem to want to be saved. They don't cry out to God. Instead, the story turns to a childless couple from the tribe of Dan. A certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. So Manoah's wife is visited by an angel of the Lord, and it's announced to her that she will indeed have a son, and that this son will be a Nazarite. The angel says to her, you will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazarite dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead, he will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hand of the Philistines. You see, a Nazarite is someone who makes a vow to dedicate themselves to God for a period of time. And they are not to cut their hair through that time. They're not to drink alcohol, they're not to touch dead things. There's a few different rules around it, but their long hair gradually becomes an obvious symbol of their dedication to the Lord. You can read all the details about that in Numbers chapter 6. But curiously here, there is no vow made by Manoah or his wife. Samson hasn't even been born yet. He can't make the vow. It seems to be that God has made this vow and given the task to Manoah and his wife to see that it happens. But poor old Manoah, he's nowhere to be seen when this angel first appears and speaks to his wife. His wife told him all about it, and with news like that, like, hey honey, I met a strange man who says I'm going to fall pregnant. Naturally, a guy's going to have a lot of questions. So Manoah prays. There are some details that he is not clear on. And he prays in chapter 13, verse 8. Then he prays to the Lord, "Pardon your servant. Lord, I beg you to let the man of God you sent come to us again and teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." And God hears his prayer. The angel of the Lord returns, and Manoah peppers him with questions. He's got a lot of questions. What are the rules for his upbringing? Even, will you stay for dinner? And at last, in verse 17, he asks, "What is your name? That we may honour you when your word comes true." Manoah must have been one of the last in Israel to express faith in the promises of God. But his question is deflected. The answer is too wonderful for Manoah to understand. The angel departs, leaving other questions for us to ponder. How will this Nazarite save Israel? And if the vow is made by God, what will he do to fulfill it? The answer seems to be a long way off as we begin the story of Samson's life. And, well, that story begins just like Israel's did. Not so well. In chapter 14, Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." Samson has laid his eyes on this woman, a foreign woman, forbidden for Israelites to marry, forbidden in God's eyes, but he is determined to get what his eyes have seen and demands that his parents go and make it happen. Now, understandably, Manoah and his wife are worried. Not only was this something that ought not to be done by any kind of Israelite, it shouldn't be done especially by a Nazarite. He's meant to be separate and holy, but there is something deeper going on here in verse 4, something that they weren't aware about. His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. Now, I understand that there will be a whole lot of questions that we will have about this. But surely there would have been, again, even more questions for Manoah. What was going to become of his son? Would he see the fulfillment of the words that the angel had said about him? What we do know is that God wants a fight. He's not going to stand on the sidelines and watch his people oppressed by the Philistines. And, well, Samson seems only too obliging. Chapter 14 and 15 is another one of those wild rides that we are accustomed to by now in the book of Judges. Firstly, 30 of the Philistines are slain by Samson in a dispute that arises at his wedding. And when they take his wife away from him, well, he'll go and set fire to their harvest. Not a great way to get along with your in-laws. And when they murder his wife, he slaughters many of them. Later, he strikes down 1,000 men with a fresh jawbone of a donkey. There are bodies on the floor everywhere in this story because through Samson, God is taking the fight to the Philistines. But Israel is not up for the fight. Even the once great tribe of Judah, who at the very, very beginning of Judges, led the charge in taking the promised land, even they come down in force to scold Samson for rocking the boat. In chapter 15, verse 11, they say, "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? Just stop." Are we beginning to see the words of the angel come true? Perhaps. But as much as Samson fights the Philistines, as much as he seems to be driven by the Lord and stirred up by his Spirit in that, he seems equally driven, equally stirred up by something else from within. As the first words of chapter 16 make clear, one day Samson went to Gaza where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. Now, I could be wrong, but I don't remember ever reading that part in my kids' Bible. when we were reading about Samson. All I ever remember was reading about his great strength. However, the actual words of the Bible, Samson's appetite has never been hidden from us. It's right there for us to see. It's us readers who get captivated by his strength and besotted with his big muscles, but clearly Samson seems to be determined to have his way and his women. And it is the woman that he has to have who becomes the one he would even give up his strength for. In chapter 16, verse 4, sometime later he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. But this time it's different. In chapter 13, he wanted his parents to get the woman that he had noticed, that he'd seen. Later, he simply wanted to satisfy himself with the prostitute. This time we are told he's in love with Delilah. This is not something that the Philistine rulers have failed to see. They know men. They know men like Samson. They know the only way to get to him will be through Delilah. And so they bribe her to find the secret of his great strength. And so chapter 16, it kind of proceeds like a comedy show. Delilah probes him for the mystery of his power. Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued. Wow, Delilah, that was tactful. She's not exactly the spy that you might think she could be, but Samson plays along anyhow. Seems like he's having a bit of fun. Bowstrings. Tie me up with bowstrings, then I'll become as weak as any other man. And she does, but she's no dummy, so she tests the theory. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He snaps the bowstrings easily. She plies him again. Try new ropes, he says. Then I'll be as weak as any other man. Braid my hair into a loom. I'll become as weak as any other man. And Samson seems to be really enjoying this. But played as she is by Samson, Delilah, she's no fool. She drops a royal flush of manipulation, hitting him where it hurts. And I'm not even going to try to do with Delilah as well as Gail did. She said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me? This is the third time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." And with such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. You see, like any bully who teases their prey, Samson eventually gets tired of the game. He's had his fun. Now it's just boring. And so he lets down his guard. Verse 17, he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." You have to ask when you read this, what was he thinking? What was he thinking? What convinced him to finally give it up? I mean, sure, Delilah nagged at him, she prodded at him, but something else nagged and prodded Samson much more. Because I think we know what it is, because we've heard him say it again and again and again in his own words. "I'll become as weak as any other man." As much as Samson has clearly enjoyed his strength, the power he had to subdue the Philistines when they attack him, he hasn't really wanted to fight them. He's wanted to marry them. He's wanted to sleep with them. And yet, he knows what he is for. He knows that he is a Nazirite, separate unto God. He knows that to cut his hair is to give up those vows, is to reject them, but he does not want to be separate unto God anymore. He wants to be like any other man. He wants to have, even if it's in pathetic weakness, what any other man can have. And so laying his head down on her lap, he hands himself over to Delilah. He hands his strength back to God, and she hands him over to the Philistines. So after putting him to sleep on her lap, so motherly is Delilah. Remember somebody else who was motherly and put someone to sleep in this book of Judges. She puts him to sleep. She calls for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair and begins to subdue him, and his strength leaves him. Samson has shown himself to be a fool. With his hair gone and the Lord departed from him, she calls out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," and he awakes and he thinks, "I'll just do what I have always done." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And just as Samson's sin was never hidden from us, neither is his foolishness. The Philistines seized their opportunity. They were never going to let him retire quietly and enjoy a quiet life with Delilah. They gouge out his eyes. They take him to their capital. Their prized prisoner can now work the mill, subdued like a dumb animal to grind the grain. Now, of course, Samson is so much more than a dumb animal. He's a stubborn one. At every opportunity, he seemed to resist God's call for him to be separate. He married a Philistine. He slept with prostitutes. He broke his Nazirite vows again and again, finally allowing his hair to be cut. He has done everything he could to throw off God's claim over his life. Everything he could do. But Samson, he is oh so familiar to us at this end of the book of Judges. Because like Samson, Israel was called to be separate, to cast out the other nations, to destroy their temples and their shrines. But again and again, they have done the very opposite, chasing after every foreign god, prostituting themselves to all of the idols. And despite enjoying great strength over their enemies when God was with them, they have again and again rejected and resisted his call to be separate from the nations, to be separate unto him. They're not even crying out to him anymore. Content, it seems, to be weak, like any other nation. Samson is Israel. Israel is Samson, a stubborn judge and a stubborn people. It could not be any clearer. But as stubborn as Israel is, God is more stubborn. And probably one of the greatest lines, I think, in the whole of the book of Judges, you can see how stubborn God is. Verse 22, "But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved." Now let me ask you this. Maybe I'll ask some of the men. Who grows your hair? Do you grow your own hair? Do you grow your own hair? I mean, sure, you can choose to cut it, but do you grow it? You don't really grow it, do you? I mean, I can tell you personally, if it was about having the will to grow your hair, I would have made a few different life choices. I'm sure, looking around, a few others would have as well. No, you can cut your hair all you like, but you can't grow it all you like. God makes your hair grow. Samson may have allowed his hair to be cut. He may have given up his secret. But do you remember who made the vow? The vow that he was to be a Nazirite, separate unto God, symbolized by his uncut hair. It was God's vow. Not Samson's, not his parents, God's. It was God who grows his hair. I think the subtle brilliance of verse 22 it reveals to us something very big. That God was not going to let his vow, his choice of Samson, to fail. Indeed, he was going to bring Samson down very low. He was going to let him suffer, but he was never going to let him go. He was never going to let him fail. In fact, by handing Samson over to the Philistines, God is not abandoning him, he is preserving him. He is preserving Samson for the very special purpose that he was set apart for. Do you remember that purpose, that mission? He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. God was using this moment, even Samson's most stubborn and foolish deed, to place Samson right at the center of his plans. Precisely. The Philistines are in jubilant song at their feast, calling out their praises to their god Dagon and calling for Samson to come and entertain them, a final mockery of the last standing symbol of Israel's strength and a massacred symbol of Israel's strength. What we missed at the start of the story, however, we finally hear on the lips of Samson in verse 28. Samson prayed to the Lord. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Finally, someone is calling out to God. God had anticipated this call from the very beginning, from the time the angel foretold his birth until this moment when he has placed Samson at the center of this pagan temple, between the 2 central pillars on which this temple stood, at the center of his will to begin to save Israel from the Philistines. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple. On the rulers and all the people in it, he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Samson achieved the purpose for which he was born, for which he was given. The Philistine leadership is decapitated. The Philistines' God is utterly humiliated. God was beginning to save his undeserving people. Thus ends the story of Samson, the man of extraordinary strength and extraordinary stubbornness and foolishness. But far more than that, this is a story of a very stubborn God. A stubborn God with a stubborn love. A God that vowed to save his people even when they would not cry out to him. A God that preserved the mission of his servant even when that servant tried to throw it away. And it's also a message of God to a rebellious Israel. That although they have rejected him and his call for them to belong to him, he will not let them go. They will be his precious and holy people. They will belong to him. And he has bound himself to them. He will not let his choice fail. His love is a stubborn love. And it's a message for us as readers of the Bible now. Because again, we see the long shadow of the cross cast back over the whole of the Old Testament. Its shadow here accentuating even this tragedy. Because there will indeed be another tragedy, where a chosen servant, a miracle son, would not reject but embrace his mission. He would not run from his enemy but stumbly journey towards it. And he would also be handed over to evil men. They would not cut out his hair or put out his eyes, but they would beat him and flay him and nail him to a cross. And placing him between 2 crosses, 2 pillars of wood, he would stretch out his arms, not in vengeance, but in love and obedience, to bring down the mighty edifice of sin and death, and pay for our rebellion, our rejection of God. God's stubborn love has a very long pedigree. We as readers are not outside of these stories. In fact, the purpose of stories, isn't it, is to invite us in, to allow us to see where we fit. Perhaps we see ourselves as recalcitrant Israel or even stupid and stubborn Samson. And there is an object lesson there perhaps for us to mull over, but better still, there is a question. A question of, who do I belong to? Do I think I belong to myself? Do I make my own destiny? Or do I belong to God? Has God determined my steps? Has God called me to be separate and holy unto Him? Or am I just seeking to be like everybody else? The final lines of the story tell us the burial of Samson. These rather sad lines. His brothers, his fathers, and his father's whole family went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah, his father. He had led Israel 20 years. It's only in passing that we learn that Samson's father, Manoah, had died. The man with all the questions was already in his tomb, making room for his son to come and lie beside him. He lived to see his son grow to a man, but he died wondering how God would fulfill his vow, how a son given through a miraculous birth would save Israel. I like to think that Manoah died in hope, knowing that it was God who vowed, that it was God to whom Samson actually belonged. It was God who could be trusted. And we won't always know how God will save. We won't know how God will use us. We won't always know the ending. We won't know how God could use a sinful one like me. But if I belong to Him, that is all that matters. That is all that matters. He will have His way. He will have His people because His love is a stubborn love. Amen.
You have been listening to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church. If you'd like to know more about Jesus, get further information, or download other resources, please visit our website at lmap.org.au.